Bryce Laspisa, the night he shouldn't have vanished. At 1:10 in the morning, a car sat silently on the side of a California highway. Inside was a 19-year-old college student. He wasn't asleep. He wasn't unconscious. And he wasn't asking for help. For more than 13 hours, Bryce Laspisa stayed right there, texting, talking to strangers, calling his parents, while the rest of the world kept moving. Then, without warning, his car was found smashed at the bottom of a ravine. Not much blood. No body. No Bryce. Today, we're not just asking where Bryce went. We're asking why so many warning signs were seen and somehow missed. Because this story isn't about a disappearance. It's about a moment in time where everything could have gone differently. Bryce David Laspisa wasn't a drifter. He wasn't running from a broken home. He wasn't known for risky behavior. He was 19 years old, a college student at Sierra College in Rocklin, California. Described by friends as intelligent, artistic, and deeply thoughtful, Bryce had a close relationship with his parents, Karen and Mike Laspisa. They spoke frequently. They trusted him. But in the weeks leading up to August 30th, 2013, something changed. Not dramatically. Not explosively. Quietly. Friends noticed Bryce had become more withdrawn, more emotional. He began drinking more heavily, something completely out of character. He started taking Vyvanse, a drug which was not prescribed to him. And then there was the breakup. Before Bryce Laspisa disappeared, there was a change in his personal life that many people knew about, but few actually suspected anything dangerous. Bryce had a girlfriend while attending Sierra College. They were close. They spent time together. Nothing about the relationship appeared unstable from the outside. But in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Bryce ended it. Not dramatically, not publicly, and not with anger. According to people close to him, Bryce told his girlfriend that he wanted to start fresh. That phrase matters. Because it wasn't tied to a fight. It wasn't tied to infidelity. And it wasn't tied to a specific incident anyone could later point to. There was no explosive argument. No dramatic breakup scene. No warning that something terrible was coming next. Instead, the breakup felt quiet, almost intentional. And that's why it stands out. The breakup happened shortly before Bryce left campus for what was supposed to be a simple drive home. This timing is important, not because it proves anything, but because it shows Bryce was actively closing chapters of his life. School, relationships, possessions, routine. People often expect emotional crises to be loud, but sometimes they look like organization. After the breakup, Bryce reportedly gave away some of his belongings, including his Xbox game console and a pair of diamond earrings that meant a lot to him. This behavior occurred shortly after he broke up with his girlfriend, Kim Sly. His change in behavior at the time could be interpreted as downsizing, preparing to move, simplifying life, or just normal college behavior. Only after he disappeared did these choices take on heavier meaning. One of the most important and often overlooked aspects of this story is what Bryce's girlfriend did not report. There were no claims that Bryce was suicidal, threatening self-harm, expressing fear, acting violently, or behaving erratically. No messages suggesting goodbye. No panic. No breakdown. That absence matters because it challenges the idea that Bryce was in obvious emotional crisis. If he was struggling internally, he hid it well. The breakup itself is not evidence of what happened to Bryce, but it is evidence of something quieter and more unsettling. Bryce was detaching, not explosively, not destructively, but deliberately, ending a relationship, giving away belongings, pausing instead of moving forward, sitting for hours when he could have driven home. These are not actions that scream danger. They whisper transition. And transitions can be fragile places. Here is the truth you need to know. Breaking up with a girlfriend does not explain Bryce's disappearance. But ignoring it removes a crucial piece of the emotional timeline. It shows that Bryce wasn't just on a road trip. He was in the middle of change. And sometimes the most dangerous moments in a person's life are not when everything is falling apart, but when they are quietly letting go. So the question isn't, did the breakup cause Bryce to disappear? The real question is this: what was Bryce trying to leave behind? And what was he hoping to reach when he got back in that car? Because whatever answer Bryce carried with him that night, he took it somewhere no one has been able to follow. And sometimes the most dangerous emotional shifts aren't loud. They're subtle, and they hide in plain sight. Now, let's talk about the drive that didn't make sense. On August 28, 2013, Bryce packed his belongings into his 2003 Toyota Highlander. He told his parents he was driving home to Southern California, a trip that should have taken about 7 hours. But Bryce never arrived. Instead, his car appeared in places that didn't fit the story. First, in Buttonwillow. Then, hours later, still not moving much at all. His parents called. Bryce answered. He sounded normal. He told them he was just tired, that he'd rest and finish the drive. But hours passed. Then more hours. By the time authorities were alerted, Bryce had been stationary for nearly half a day. And here's where the story quietly becomes disturbing. The first police encounter. By the time police first encountered Bryce Laspisa, he wasn't missing. He wasn't injured. He wasn't reported as endangered. And he wasn't breaking the law. He was just sitting. It was late on August 28, 2013. Bryce had already been on the road for hours, driving south from Sierra College toward his parents' home in Southern California. At some point near Buttonwillow, Bryce pulled over and stayed there, not for minutes, not for an hour, but for hours. Eventually, his unusual behavior drew attention, and law enforcement made contact. This would become the first official police encounter in a case that would later haunt everyone involved. When officers approached Bryce's vehicle, they didn't find chaos. They didn't find panic. They didn't find someone in distress. They found a 19-year-old college student sitting calmly in his SUV. He was cooperative. He answered questions clearly. He knew where he was. He knew where he was going. Most importantly, he did not appear impaired. No slurred speech. No confusion. No visible intoxication. From the outside, Bryce looked exactly like what he claimed to be. A tired young man taking a break during a long drive. Officers assessed Bryce for the things they are trained to look for: alcohol impairment, drug influence, medical distress, disorientation. They found none. Bryce did not fail sobriety checks. He did not exhibit erratic behavior. He did not say anything alarming. He did not ask for help. And that mattered, because police authority has limits. Without evidence of danger to himself or others, they had no legal reason to detain him. So after a brief interaction, they let him go. Here's the part that makes this encounter so unsettling. After being cleared by police, Bryce didn't leave. He stayed right there. Same place, same car, same silence. And this is where hindsight becomes painful. Because today, people ask, why didn't police push harder? Why didn't someone insist he leave? Why didn't anyone recognize this as a warning sign? But at the time, there was no warning sign. Bryce passed every test. This first police interaction is not about what went wrong. It's about what didn't go wrong. There was no struggle, no mistake, no misarrest, just a young man who seemed fine, and a system that can only act on what it can see. And Bryce gave them nothing to see. In missing person cases, we often expect danger to announce itself. Crying, shouting, threats, breakdowns. But Bryce didn't do any of that. His red flag wasn't chaos. It was stillness. He wasn't running. He wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He was paused. And pauses are not crimes. When police drove away that night, they likely forgot the encounter almost immediately. Just another routine stop. Another tired driver. Another cleared check. But in hindsight, this moment would become one of the last times Bryce Laspisa was seen alive by someone who could confirm it. And that's what makes it unbearable. Not that police failed, but that Bryce didn't give them anything to save him from the phone calls that still echo. Bryce spoke to his parents again. They begged him to come home. He told them he was fine, that he loved them, that he'd leave soon. But he didn't. Shortly after, he had a roadside assistance encounter. Hours after Bryce Laspisa had been cleared by police, someone else noticed him. Not because he was acting wild, not because he was causing a scene, but because he was still there. On the side of the road near Buttonwillow, California, Bryce's Toyota Highlander had run out of gas. That's when a roadside assistance worker arrived. And this encounter would become one of the most quietly unsettling moments in the entire case. When the worker approached Bryce's vehicle, nothing appeared wrong. No flashing hazard lights in panic. No frantic phone calls. No visible distress. Bryce was seated calmly inside his SUV. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't asking urgent questions. He simply waited. The worker later described Bryce as polite, coherent, and normal. That word again, normal. The worker spoke with Bryce while refueling the vehicle. Bryce answered questions appropriately. He knew where he was. He knew where he was going. He knew who he was. There was no sign of intoxication, no confusion, no emotional outburst. If anything, Bryce seemed distant, not upset, not anxious, just quiet. And for a roadside assistance worker, that isn't unusual. Long drives, late nights, tired people. Nothing about Bryce triggered alarm. After refueling the car, the worker expected Bryce to leave. That's the natural next step. You get gas. You get back on the road. But Bryce didn't. He stayed parked. The worker left, and Bryce remained. This detail, so small at the time, would later echo louder than anything Bryce said. Because this wasn't a moment of exhaustion. It was a choice. This roadside assistance encounter matters for one reason. It confirms that Bryce had every opportunity to continue home. His car was working. He was alert. He wasn't impaired. No one was preventing him from leaving. And yet, he didn't. In missing person cases, we often look for a single dramatic failure, a mistake, a missed clue, a broken system. But here, there was no failure. Just a young man who kept choosing to stay still. The worker didn't see a mental breakdown, a person in crisis, someone asking for help. And that's important, because it shows Bryce was not outwardly signaling distress. If Bryce was struggling internally, he hid it carefully. And that makes the mystery harder, not easier. There is something deeply unsettling about the space between events in this case. Police checked on Bryce. Roadside assistance helped him. His parents spoke to him. And between each interaction, Bryce waited. as if time itself didn't matter anymore, as if he wasn't ready to go forward, but didn't know how to go back. At around 2 a.m. on August 30th, Bryce's Highlander was discovered at the bottom of a steep embankment near Castaic Lake. The vehicle had clearly gone over intentionally, but what investigators found next raised more questions than answers. The back window was broken from the inside. There was minimal blood. Bryce's phone gone. His wallet gone. His shoes left behind. People don't vanish by accident. When investigators reached the ravine near Castaic Lake, they expected to find a severely injured or deceased driver. Instead, they found something far more unsettling. The Toyota Highlander had gone over the embankment nose first, rolling and stopping against trees and brush. The crash doesn't look too violent, but Bryce's body wasn't there. Not nearby, not trapped, not thrown from the vehicle. And most striking of all, the damage didn't match a high-speed accident. This wasn't a panic loss of control. This was controlled. The back window was broken from the inside, suggesting Bryce exited the vehicle on his own. The car doors were not crushed shut. The airbags had deployed, but there was no blood trail leading away. Which leads to a quiet but critical realization. Bryce likely walked away from that crash. Inside the vehicle, investigators found Bryce's shoes. Not scattered, not torn, placed. People often dismiss this detail, but it matters. Walking barefoot through that terrain would have been painful, slow, and dangerous. Sharp rocks, thorns, steep elevation changes, yet no clear barefoot tracks were ever confirmed. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Why would someone remove their shoes unless they weren't planning to go far? Or unless they believed they were done traveling? Search dogs were brought in. They picked up Bryce's scent and followed it. Down the embankment. Away from the car. Toward the lake. Then suddenly, it stopped. Not faded. Stopped. As if Bryce entered another environment. Water. Or a surface where scent doesn't carry. Castaic Lake is vast, deep, cold in certain areas, even during summer. And yet, despite extensive searches, no body was ever recovered. No clothing, no remains. Which forces investigators into a corner. If Bryce entered the lake, why wasn't anything found? This case is often simplified. A breakup. Stress. Alcohol. Unprescribed drugs. But simplification erases something crucial. Bryce was not impulsive that night. He waited. For hours. He interacted calmly with police. He spoke clearly to his parents. He made deliberate choices. This wasn't chaos. This was contemplation. Long, heavy contemplation. And when people reach that state, their actions don't always look dramatic. They look quiet. Still, final. There's a subtle detail that rarely gets attention. Bryce did not turn off his phone. Not lost it. Not broken it. That is not the action of someone panicking. It's the action of someone deciding. Deciding not to be suspected. Deciding not to be found. Yet. Or deciding that conversations were over. Some believe Bryce staged the crash and started a new life. But that theory collapses under scrutiny. No money trail. No identity use. No sightings that hold up. Others believe the lake holds the answer. But even that explanation leaves gaps. And then there's a third possibility, one rarely considered. That Bryce didn't plan to die, but he also didn't plan to return. That he walked away in a state where survival wasn't the goal, only escape. From pressure, from expectation, from the weight he couldn't explain. Bryce's parents never stopped searching. They've walked that terrain. They've studied every report. They've replayed every phone call. They were there, emotionally, right up until the end. And that's what makes this story hurt differently. Bryce wasn't alone, but something inside him was. Some mysteries fade with time. Others grow louder. Bryce Laspisa's story isn't getting quieter, because somewhere between that parked car and that dark lake is a truth that still hasn't surfaced. Do you believe Bryce intended to vanish forever, or was that night meant to end differently? What detail in this case won't leave your mind? There are stories that end with answers. And then there are stories that end with a silence so heavy it follows you long after the video stops. Bryce Laspisa's story lives in that silence. Because what lingers isn't the crash, or the lake, or the search maps. What lingers is the space between moments, the pauses we rarely think about. The pause before someone says, "I'm fine." The pause before a parent believes it. The pause before a life quietly changes direction. We like to believe warning signs are obvious, that they announce themselves, that they demand attention. But sometimes they whisper, and whispers are easy to miss in a loud world. Bryce didn't disappear in a blaze of chaos. He disappeared in stillness, in waiting, in thinking, in being awake while the rest of the world slept. And that's what makes this story uncomfortable, because it forces us to confront a truth we'd rather avoid. Not all goodbyes sound like goodbyes. Some look like normal phone calls. Some sound like reassurance. Some are wrapped in love. And sometimes, the people who care the most are only one step behind a door they never knew was closing. There's a tendency, when faced with unresolved stories, to demand conclusions, to choose a theory, to label an ending, to tie a bow around the unknown. But not every story allows that. And maybe this one isn't asking to be solved. Maybe it's asking to be felt. Felt by anyone who has ever sat alone with thoughts they couldn't explain. Felt by anyone who has ever been told, "You seem okay," when they weren't. Felt by anyone who has ever assumed time would fix something that needed presence instead. Somewhere tonight, a light is still left on. Not because someone expects footsteps at the door, but because hope doesn't need certainty to survive. Hope only needs love. And love, in this story, never disappeared. If there's anything to take from Bryce's story, it isn't fear. It's awareness. It's the quiet responsibility to listen longer, to ask twice, to sit with someone even when they say they're fine. Because sometimes being there doesn't change the ending, but sometimes it changes everything. For Bryce, for those still waiting, and for the ones who haven't learned how to ask for help yet, may we learn to hear the pauses. Some stories don't end. They linger, not in headlines, not in timelines, but in the quiet moments when you're alone and a question refuses to leave. Bryce Laspisa didn't vanish from the world. He vanished from certainty, and that's harder to live with, because certainty gives us comfort. Mystery asks us to sit with discomfort, to admit that sometimes love doesn't arrive in time. He wasn't running. He wasn't lost. He was thinking. And sometimes, thinking feels heavier than moving. There was a moment, maybe only seconds long, where everything was still possible. And no one will ever know what choice was made inside that silence. But here's what we do know. Someone was loved, someone mattered, and someone is still remembered. And remembrance is its own form of presence. So if this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, If it made you think of someone you haven't checked on in a while, don't ignore that feeling. Send the message. Make the call. Sit a little longer, because not every goodbye sounds like goodbye. Some sound like, "I'm okay." And sometimes, the most important thing we can do is listen anyway. So if you want more deep, carefully researched stories about real people and real mysteries that refuse to fade, subscribe. Because somewhere out there are still unanswered questions waiting to be heard. And the next story might stay with you even longer.